Ghost stopped, his body a rigid line of focused intent, a low whine vibrating in his chest. It was not the alert posture of a predator sighted, nor the eager stance of a scent trail found. It was something else, something Jacob Thorne had not seen in the 3 years since the Belgian Malinois had been retired from service and entrusted to his care. The dog's gaze was fixed on the lip of a steep, overgrown ravine choked with sword ferns and devil's club, a place they had passed 100 times on their treks through the dense Oregon woods. Jacob, leaning heavily on a worn cedar branch he used as a walking staff, felt a familiar prickle of unease. Ghost was his barometer, his early warning system for the seismic shifts in the world, both seen and unseen. The dog's stillness was a shout in the profound silence of the forest. "What is it, boy?" Jacob's voice was rough, rusted from disuse. He followed the dog's line of sight but saw nothing but a wall of indifferent green. Ghost ignored him, taking a few stiff steps forward, the whine deepening into a sound of profound distress. He looked back at Jacob, his intelligent eyes pleading, then turned again to the ravine's edge. This was not a request, it was a summons. Jacob's knee ached, a constant, grinding reminder of the ambush, the fall, the life that had ended so his could continue. He pushed the memory down, a practiced and futile exercise. He trusted the dog more than he trusted his own senses, more than he trusted any person left in his world. With a sigh that seemed to draw up all the weariness from the damp soil, he limped after Ghost. The descent was treacherous. Wet leaves and loose scree shifted under his boots. Ghost moved with a preternatural certainty, navigating the treacherous slope as if drawn by an invisible cord. Jacob followed, his hand brushing against the cold, wet bark of ancient firs, the smell of decay and damp earth filling his lungs. Halfway down, he saw it. A glint of metal, unnatural and wrong against the organic tapestry of the forest floor. It was a curved piece of aluminum, mottled with corrosion and draped in a thick shroud of moss and vines, looking like the rib of some long-dead leviathan. Ghost was already there, pawing at the earth near the object, his whine now a frantic, digging whimper. Jacob's heart began a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He knelt, his bad knee screaming in protest, and began to pull away the clinging vegetation. More of the structure revealed itself, a shattered cockpit window, a section of fuselage peppered with rivets, the faded ghost of a star and bar insignia. It was a plane. An old one. A tomb, swallowed by the wilderness. Ghost nudged his hand, then pointed his muzzle toward a crushed section of the cockpit. Wedged beneath a twisted piece of the instrument panel, almost completely obscured by decades of soil and leaf litter, was a dark green metal footlocker. A surge of cold dread, sharp and familiar, washed over Jacob. He had seen lockers like this before, filled with the last worldly possessions of men who were never coming home. Ghost sat back on his haunches, his duty done, and watched Jacob with an unnerving calm, as if he knew this was not an end, but a beginning. The hinges were fused with rust, the lock a solid block of corrosion. Back in his small, isolated cabin, the footlocker sat on the rough-hewn pine of his floor like a dark accusation. Ghost lay with his head on his paws, watching Jacob's every move. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the wood stove and the rasp of the file in Jacob's hand. He worked with a meticulous patience born of long, empty hours and a past that had required him to understand how things came apart. The skills he'd learned to disarm explosive ordnance now served a more somber purpose. He wasn't defusing a bomb, but perhaps something just as volatile, a life, sealed away and forgotten. Finally, with a painful groan of tortured metal, the lock gave way. He lifted the heavy lid. The air that escaped was stale, carrying the faint, dry scent of paper, leather, and time itself. Inside, nestled in the dark green interior, lay 3 objects. The first was a leather-bound journal, its cover warped by moisture but otherwise intact. On top of it rested a single, tarnished silver wing, the kind a pilot earns. Beneath that, peeking out from under the journal, was the corner of a photograph. Jacob's hands, scarred and calloused, trembled slightly as he reached inside. He picked up the photograph first. It was a black-and-white portrait of a young woman with a radiant smile and eyes that seemed to hold a universe of warmth. A name was written on the back in elegant cursive, "My Clara." He set it carefully on the table, a silent witness. He then lifted the pilot's wing. It was heavy in his palm, cold and freighted with the weight of a life's ambition. He could almost feel the pride of the man who had first pinned it to his chest. Lastly, he took the journal. He opened it to the first page. The ink was faded but legible, the handwriting a strong, confident script. Elias Vance, 2nd Lt. U.S. Army Air Forces. September 12, 1943. May these words find their way home, even if I do not. A chill traced its way down Jacob's spine. He felt like a trespasser, a grave robber of memories. He looked at Ghost, who blinked slowly, as if giving him permission. He settled into his worn armchair, the footlocker open at his feet, and began to read. The early entries were full of the bravado and excitement of a young man at war, the thrill of flying the P-38 Lightning, the camaraderie with his squadron, the endless, aching love for Clara, whose letters were his lifeline. Elias wrote with a poet's soul, describing the cathedrals of clouds, and the sacred silence at 20,000 feet. Jacob felt a pang of something he couldn't name, a kinship with this man he'd never met, this voice from the grave who spoke of duty and love with a clarity Jacob had long since lost. He read for hours as the light outside faded from gray to indigo, the words on the page pulling him deeper into a world that was both foreign and achingly familiar. As Jacob delved further into the journal, the tone began to shift. The boyish enthusiasm gave way to a hardened weariness, the descriptions of flight replaced by a growing sense of unease. A new name appeared with increasing frequency, Captain Mitchell. At first, Elias described his commanding officer with the requisite respect, noting his experience and his decorated record. But subtle notes of discord began to creep in. "Mitchell pushes us too hard," Elias wrote in an entry from early 1944. "Not for the mission, but for the glory. He risks men for headlines, not for objectives. He calls it courage. I'm starting to think it's something else." Jacob's own ghost stirred in the quiet of the cabin. He saw the face of his own CO, Lieutenant Colonel Davies, heard his confident voice briefing them on the mission in the Tangi Valley. "A simple snatch and grab," he'd said. "Low risk." But the intelligence was bad, the timing was off, and Davies, chasing a promotion, had pushed them forward anyway. The result was a perfectly executed ambush. Jacob remembered the deafening roar, the flash of the RPG, the sight of his friend, Corporal Miller, disappearing in a cloud of dust and fire. The official report cited an unforeseeable enemy escalation. Jacob knew the truth. It was a failure of leadership, a sacrifice on the altar of ambition. He had carried that silent truth like a shard of shrapnel in his soul ever since. He looked down at the journal in his hands, his knuckles white. Elias Vance, it seemed, had carried a similar burden. The entries grew more cryptic and fearful. "Something is wrong," Elias wrote. "Crates on the manifests that don't belong. Flights to neutral airfields that are never logged. Mitchell met with a man in Lisbon, it didn't look like military business. I saw money change hands. What am I supposed to do? Who do I report this to? He's a hero. I'm just a kid from Oregon." The last entry was dated October 26, 1944. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. "He knows I suspect. He assigned me a solo reconnaissance flight tomorrow. Bad weather is rolling in. A new route," he said, "over the Cascades. It makes no sense. I've secured the proof in my footlocker. A ledger I copied. If something happens, this was no accident. Clara, my love, I'm sorry." Jacob closed the journal, his breathing shallow. A solo flight. A sudden route change. A convenient storm. It was a narrative he understood with chilling clarity. This wasn't just a pilot who had lost his way in a storm, this was a man who had been silenced. The injustice of it burned in his chest, a clean, hot flame that cauterized some of his own festering wounds. He looked from the journal to the tarnished wing, then to the smiling face of Clara. He felt a profound and unexpected sense of duty. He had survived his own valley of shadows. He had been given the chance to walk away, even if he was broken. Elias Vance had not. In the deep quiet of his self-imposed exile, a new mission had found him. He would be the voice for this ghost. He would find the truth that had been buried for 70 years. The next morning, for the first time in months, Jacob drove his old pickup truck into the small town of North Fork. The place was little more than a wide spot in the road, with a gas station, a post office, and a general store that seemed to have been there since the logging boom. Sam's Mercantile was run by Sam Lim, a Korean War veteran whose quiet presence was as much a fixture of the town as the perpetually misty mountains that surrounded it. Sam was a man of few words and deep perception. He watched Jacob enter, his stooped shoulders and the haunted look in his eyes a familiar sight. But today, something was different. There was a flinty spark in Jacob's gaze that hadn't been there before. "Need supplies, Jake?" Sam asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Not today, Sam," Jacob replied, his voice still hoarse. He placed the tarnished silver wing on the dusty wooden counter. "I need information. You ever seen one of these from around here?" Sam picked up the wing, his gnarled fingers surprisingly delicate. He turned it over, his eyes narrowing. "Army Air Corps. World War II. Haven't seen one in a long time. My uncle flew B-17s over Germany. Never came back." He looked at Jacob, a question in his eyes that he didn't voice. "Found a wreck," Jacob stated simply, offering no more. "Up in the ridges," Sam nodded slowly, accepting the sparse explanation. That was how men like them communicated, in the vast, open spaces between words. "If it's a World War II wreck from this area, the Historical Society might have something. Old Martha keeps records of everything. Plane crashes, logging accidents, who cheated at cards in 1952. You looking for a name?" "Elias Vance," Jacob said. The name felt solid, real, spoken aloud in the world of the living. Sam's brow furrowed. "Vance. Vance. Doesn't ring a bell. But there was a big war hero from around here. Mitchell. Captain Robert Mitchell. Big timber family. Made a fortune after the war. Town practically named a street after him. He passed 5, maybe 6 years ago." Jacob's body went rigid. "Mitchell. The name from the journal. He was a pilot." P-38 pilot, Sam confirmed, his eyes sharp, connecting a dot Jacob hadn't yet revealed. "Celebrated. They said he was fearless," Jacob repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He thanked Sam and left, the bell over the door chiming his departure. The Historical Society was a small, musty room in the back of the town library. Martha, a woman with a cloud of white hair and glasses thick as bottle glass, presided over a kingdom of filing cabinets and yellowed newspapers. When Jacob gave her the name and the approximate date, her face lit up. "Oh, the Vance crash. Yes, a tragedy. He was stationed at the airbase over in Portland. Went down in a storm. They searched for weeks, but never found the plane." She pulled out a large, bound volume of the North Fork Chronicle. She flipped through the brittle pages, a dry, papery scent filling the air. She stopped, running a finger down a column of text. "Here it is. October 27, 1944. Local pilot missing, presumed lost, a terrible shame." She then found another article from a few weeks later. The headline read, "Inquiry cites pilot error in Vance disappearance." Jacob's jaw tightened. The report said pilot error. "That's what it says," Martha said, peering at the text. "Says here the flight was unauthorized, that Lieutenant Vance disregarded weather warnings. A sad case of youthful recklessness. It was his commanding officer, Captain Mitchell, who had to make the unfortunate report. He was a local boy, you know. A real hero. Jacob left the library with the copied articles in his hand, the official story a neat, tidy lie that erased a good man's name. His next stop was a long shot, a search through old phone directories and public records for anyone related to Clara, the woman in the photograph. He found a promising lead, a family with the same surname, whose lineage in the area traced back to the 1930s. He ended up at a small, well-kept house on the edge of town, a garden full of late-blooming roses lining the walkway. An elderly woman with kind, tired eyes answered the door. "Can I help you?" she asked. "My name is Jacob Thorne," he began, feeling the awkwardness of his intrusion. "I'm looking for anyone who might have known a woman named Clara Jensen. This is going to sound strange, but I believe she was connected to a pilot from the war, Elias Vance." The woman's face softened with a look of profound, ancient sadness. "I am Eleanor. Clara was my great-aunt." She invited him in, her movements slow and deliberate. The house was filled with memories, sepia-toned photographs on the mantelpiece, delicate china in a glass-fronted cabinet. Eleanor sat opposite Jacob in a floral armchair, her hands folded in her lap. "Aunt Clara passed away many years ago," she said softly. "But I remember her well. She was never the same after Elias was lost. She was so full of life, so vibrant. After he was gone, the light just went out of her." Jacob felt a knot form in his throat. He pulled the photograph of Clara from his jacket pocket and handed it to Eleanor. Her breath hitched. "Oh, my," she whispered, tracing the smiling face with a trembling fingertip. "He carried this with him. I found it." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "She gave it to him before he deployed. She told me she felt a piece of her soul went with him." "The official report said the crash was his fault," Jacob said gently. Eleanor's expression hardened. Clara never believed that. Not for a second. She said Elias was the most careful, most honorable man she had ever known. He wouldn't have been reckless. He wouldn't have broken the rules. She went to a small writing desk in the corner and returned with a small, ribbon-tied bundle of letters. "These are his letters to her. She let me read them when I was a girl. He wrote about everything. About flying. About how much he missed her. And he wrote about his commanding officer." Jacob leaned forward. "Captain Mitchell?" Eleanor nodded. "He didn't trust him. He said Captain Mitchell was a dangerous man, obsessed with his own reputation. In his last letter, he said he was worried. He said he thought Mitchell might be putting him in harm's way because of something he'd found out. Clara took that letter to the authorities after Elias disappeared. They dismissed her. They said she was a grieving, hysterical woman and that Captain Mitchell was a war hero above reproach." The story solidified, the pieces clicking into place. This wasn't just about a historical record, it was about the lifelong heartbreak of a woman who had died believing in a truth no one else would hear. It was for her, too. For Clara. "They were wrong," Jacob said, his voice low but firm. "Elias was telling the truth. I found his journal." He explained what he had read, the details of the final, frantic entry. As he spoke, he could see decades of doubt and sorrow lifting from Eleanor's face, replaced by a fierce, validating light. "So she was right," Eleanor whispered, clutching the letters to her chest. All this time, she was right. The mission was no longer an abstract duty. It now had a face, a name, and a legacy of pain. It was a promise to be kept, not just for the dead pilot, but for the woman who had loved him. The Mitchell Timber Empire was headquartered in a sleek, modern building of glass and steel on the outskirts of Portland, a world away from the misty forests where Jacob lived. He had called ahead, requesting a meeting with Marcus Mitchell, the grandson of the late Captain Robert Mitchell. He had been intentionally vague, mentioning only that he had information regarding his grandfather's military service. He was shown into a corner office with a panoramic view of the city. Marcus Mitchell was a man in his late 40s, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, with a confident handshake and an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked like a man accustomed to being in control. "Mr. Thorne," he said, gesturing to a leather chair. "Thank you for coming. My assistant said you had something for me regarding my grandfather. Jacob sat, feeling out of place in his worn jeans and flannel shirt. He decided on a direct approach. I recently discovered the crash site of a P-38 Lightning that went down in the Cascades in 1944. The pilot was a Lieutenant Elias Vance. Marcus's polite expression didn't change, but Jacob saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a guarded tension. Vance, he repeated. I can't say I recall the name from my grandfather's stories. He flew in your grandfather's squadron, Jacob continued, his voice steady. Captain Mitchell was his CO. He was the one who filed the report on the crash. He paused, letting the silence stretch. The report cited pilot error. It said Lieutenant Vance was on an unauthorized flight. My grandfather was a decorated officer, Marcus said, his tone becoming cooler. He made difficult decisions. War is a messy business. I also found the pilot's personal effects, Jacob said, pressing on. Including his journal. At the mention of the journal, Marcus's composure finally broke. A muscle in his jaw twitched. A journal? What exactly is your point, Mr. Thorne? The journal tells a different story, Jacob said, holding his gaze. It tells the story of a young pilot who believed his commanding officer was involved in illegal activities. It tells the story of a man who was afraid for his life, who believed he was being sent on a suicide mission to be silenced. A mission assigned by your grandfather. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Marcus stood up, his face flushing with anger. This is outrageous. Are you trying to blackmail me? My grandfather was a hero. He built this company from nothing. His reputation is spotless. This isn't about money, Jacob said quietly. It's about the truth. Elias Vance was an honorable man. His name was destroyed to cover up a crime. You're a liar, Marcus spat, his voice rising. You come in here, some disturbed vet hiding out in the woods, and you think you can slander a great man's name based on some 70-year-old diary you found? Get out of my office. The journal mentions a ledger, Jacob said, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. Proof of black market dealings. Vance said he had it with him. Marcus's face went pale. He pointed a trembling finger at the door. Get out. Now. If I hear one more word of this, from you or anyone else, I'll use every resource I have to make you regret it. You have no idea who you're dealing with. As Jacob walked out of the building and back into the gray afternoon, he knew the battle had been joined. This was no longer about the past. It was about the present. Marcus wasn't just protecting a legacy, he was protecting a secret. And he would do anything to keep it buried. The retaliation was swift and impersonal. A week after his meeting with Marcus, Jacob received a certified letter from a law firm representing the Mitchell Timber Company. It was a formal eviction notice. The letter stated that his cabin was on land owned by the company and that his informal lease, arranged years ago with a sympathetic foreman who had since retired, was terminated. He had 30 days to vacate the premises. The ground, which had felt so solid beneath his feet, had suddenly turned to sand. The cabin wasn't just a home, it was his fortress, his sanctuary from a world he couldn't navigate. The thought of being forced out, of having to face the noise and the crowds and the suffocating proximity of people, sent a wave of panic through him. The nights grew longer. The familiar shadows in his cabin began to twist into menacing shapes. The silence, once a comfort, now amplified the ringing in his ears. Sleep offered no escape, dragging him back to the dust and fire of the Tangi Valley, the face of Corporal Miller forever frozen in his mind's eye. He stopped eating. He stopped chopping wood. He would sit for hours in his armchair, the journal open on his lap, staring at the words without seeing them. Ghost, ever sensitive to his master's state, refused to leave his side, resting his heavy head on Jacob's knee, whining softly, a warm, living anchor in a sea of spiraling dread. One afternoon, as a low, bruised sky promised a coming storm, Sam's truck rumbled up the muddy track to the cabin. He found Jacob on the porch, staring blankly at the tree lean, a ghost in his own life. Sam didn't say a word. He just sat down on the steps, pulled out 2 tin cups and a thermos, and poured coffee. For a long time, they sat in silence, the only sound the sighing of the wind in the pines. "Heard you got a notice from the timber company," Sam said finally. Jacob just nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Marcus Mitchell," Sam continued, as if stating a simple fact. "His grandfather was a hard man. Proud. Some said cruel. Pride like that, it leaves long shadows." He took a sip of his coffee. "I was in Korea. Near the Chosin Reservoir. We were retreating, overrun. There was a kid, maybe 18, from Tennessee. He was wounded, couldn't walk. We were ordered to keep moving, no one left behind who could slow us down. My CO told me to leave him. I did. I can still hear him calling for his mother." Sam's voice was flat, devoid of self-pity. He had never spoken of the war to Jacob before. "I carried that for 40 years, he said, looking at his gnarled hands. Tried to drink it away, work it away, hide from it. Didn't work. The ghost of that boy was always with me. It wasn't until I finally accepted it, until I started talking to him, in a manner of speaking, that I found any peace. I started sponsoring a scholarship in his hometown. Sent his family a letter, told them he was brave. It wasn't forgiveness. It was an answer." He looked at Jacob, his eyes clear and deep. "Some ghosts don't want to be fought, Jake. They want to be heard. Maybe this pilot, this Elias, maybe he's not the only one who needs to be heard." The first fat drops of rain began to fall, pattering on the tin roof of the porch. A low rumble of thunder echoed through the valley. The storm Sam had spoken of was no longer just a metaphor. It was here. And in that moment, something shifted in Jacob. The fog in his mind began to clear, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't just Elias's fight. It was his, too. It was his answer to the boy from Tennessee, to Corporal Miller, to all the ghosts he had tried to outrun. The storm broke with a primal fury. Wind tore through the forest, lashing the trees into a frenzy. Rain fell in solid, blinding sheets, turning the dirt track into a river of mud. The power in the cabin flickered and died, plunging Jacob into darkness, save for the frantic dance of the fire in the wood stove. A sudden, inexplicable urgency seized him. It was a feeling he knew well from his time in the field, a gut instinct that transcended logic, a warning that the enemy was on the move. Marcus. The wreck. The ledger. Marcus knew about the ledger now. He would go there. He would destroy the last piece of evidence, using the cover of the storm to erase his family's sin. "Come on, Ghost," Jacob said, grabbing his rain gear and a heavy-duty flashlight. The dog was already on his feet, sensing the shift in his master, ready for the command. The drive down the mountain was a battle against the elements. The truck skidded on the slick road, and fallen branches littered their path. When he could drive no further, Jacob abandoned the truck and set off on foot, the flashlight beam cutting a weak tunnel through the maelstrom. The wind howled like a tortured animal, and the roar of the engorged creek in the ravine was deafening. He followed the familiar path, now a treacherous, churning waterway. When he reached the ravine's edge, he saw it. Another flashlight beam, far below, moving erratically near the wreck. He half ran, half slid down the muddy embankment, Ghost at his heels, the dog's paws finding purchase where Jacob could not. He found Marcus Mitchell standing over the fuselage, drenched and wild-eyed. In his hand, he held a heavy crowbar, which he brought down again and again against the brittle aluminum of the cockpit. The sound of metal striking metal was a discordant clang against the symphony of the storm. "Mitchell!" Jacob shouted over the wind. Marcus spun around, his face a mask of desperation and fury. "You," he screamed. "You won't leave it alone. Stop!" Jacob yelled, moving closer. "This won't fix anything. It will fix everything." Marcus retorted, raising the crowbar again. "My grandfather gave his life building our name. I won't let you, a nobody, tear it down with your fantasies. Jacob stopped a few feet away. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't shout back. He lowered his voice, forcing Marcus to strain to hear him over the storm. His name was Elias Vance, he said, his voice imbued with a strange calm. He was 24 years old. He loved a woman named Clara. He loved flying. He wrote about seeing cathedrals in the clouds. He wasn't a fantasy. He was a man. A good man, who your grandfather murdered. He saw a flicker of doubt in Marcus's eyes. He took another step. I know what it's like, Jacob said, and the words came from a place he had kept locked away for years. I know what it's like to follow orders from a man you trust, a hero, and watch him get your friends killed for his own pride. I know what it's like to carry that, to let it eat you alive from the inside out. Is that the legacy you want? The one that's built on silence and a lie? Above them, a groaning, cracking sound tore through the din of the storm. Jacob's gaze shot upward. A massive widowmaker, a dead branch the size of a small tree, was breaking loose from an ancient fir, directly above a stunned and frozen Marcus. There was no time to think. It was the Tangi Valley all over again. A choice. A body to be moved. In one explosive movement, Jacob launched himself forward, shoving Marcus hard. They tumbled into the mud together as the massive branch crashed down with the force of an artillery shell, landing precisely where Marcus had been standing. It shattered against the plane's wing, sending splinters of rotten wood flying through the air. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain and their own ragged breathing. Jacob lay on the ground, a searing pain shooting through his shoulder where a piece of the branch had struck him. Marcus pushed himself up, his expensive suit ruined, his face smeared with mud. He stared at the shattered branch, then at Jacob, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. You saved me," he stammered. Jacob gritted his teeth against the pain and pushed himself into a sitting position. He deserved to have his story told, he said, his voice strained. That's all. Just the truth. The fight had gone out of Marcus. The anger, the pride, the carefully constructed defenses, all of it washed away by the rain and the stark reality of what had just happened. He looked at the wreckage of the plane, then back at Jacob, and something inside him finally broke. He told me, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. My grandfather. On his deathbed. He was delirious, rambling. He talked about the war, about a young pilot. Vance. He said he'd found out about the side business. He said he couldn't let the kid ruin everything he'd built. He said he switched the fuel lines, something small, something that would look like mechanical failure in the storm. He called it, cutting a corner, he cried. A man I'd never seen show an ounce of weakness. He cried because he was afraid of going to hell. The confession hung in the air, a secret finally given voice, losing its power in the telling. All the bluster, all the threats, had been the desperate actions of a man terrified of confirming the monster in his family's story was real. He was not protecting a hero, he was hiding a murderer. I spent my whole life trying to live up to the legend of Robert Mitchell, Marcus said, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I guess I was just afraid to admit the legend was a lie. Jacob looked at the man, no longer an antagonist but just a person shackled to a toxic inheritance. He saw not an enemy to be defeated, but a soul to be freed. The path forward was not through revenge or recrimination, but through restoration. The ledger, Jacob said, his voice quiet but firm. Vance said he had a ledger. It's probably still in there. Together, in the pouring rain, the two men worked. Using the crowbar not as a weapon of destruction but as a tool of recovery, they pried open a crushed storage compartment behind the pilot's seat. And there it was. A small, oilskin-wrapped package. Inside was a thin ledger book, its pages filled with Elias Vance's neat handwriting, detailing dates, flight paths, and cargo that corresponded with illicit shipments of medical supplies and other goods, all authorized by Captain Robert Mitchell. The proof. The truth, preserved for 70 years, waiting for the storm that would finally bring it to light. In the weeks that followed, the world realigned itself. With the ledger and the journal as undeniable evidence, Marcus Mitchell, to his credit, did not hide. He used his considerable resources to do the one thing Jacob could not: he forced the system to look at itself. He hired a team of historians and legal experts to present the case to the Department of the Army. The bureaucracy moved slowly, but with the weight of the Mitchell family now pushing for the truth instead of against it, it moved. Months later, the official notification came. The finding of pilot error in the crash of Lieutenant Elias Vance was overturned. His record was posthumously corrected to reflect that he had died in the line of duty while honorably serving his country. Marcus arranged for a small, dignified ceremony at the local Veterans Hall. He invited Eleanor. Jacob stood at the back of the room, watching as a crisply uniformed officer presented the elderly woman with a folded American flag and a newly minted silver wing, polished and gleaming. Eleanor clutched the wing to her chest, her face streaked with tears, not of sorrow, but of peace. The light that had gone out in her great-aunt Clara so long ago seemed, in that moment, to be rekindled in her. After the ceremony, Marcus found Jacob. "The cabin," he said, his voice subdued. "The eviction is rescinded. It's yours. As long as you want it." Jacob simply nodded. The cabin was no longer a fortress to hide in, but simply a home. A few days later, another visitor made the journey up the mountain. His sister, Sarah, stepped out of her clean city car and looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time in years. She saw the tension was gone from his shoulders. She saw the clarity in his eyes. He was still quiet, still scarred, but he was no longer lost. He was present. "I heard what you did," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud of you, Jake." They didn't need to say more. The years of friction and misunderstanding dissolved in the quiet mountain air. He was no longer the broken soldier she had to worry about, but her brother, who had found his way back by helping someone else. The healing had begun. Jacob didn't leave the woods. But his isolation ended. He started spending 2 days a week at Sam's store, not for supplies, but to help. Sam had quietly started an informal support group for local vets. They'd sit around the pot-bellied stove, drinking coffee, talking or not talking, simply sharing the silence. Jacob, who had never been able to speak of his own trauma, found he could listen. He could recognize the shadows in other men's eyes and offer them the same quiet understanding Sam had once offered him. He had found a new kind of service. The story ends, as it began, on a ridge overlooking a ravine. It is early spring. The snow has melted, and the first green shoots of new life are pushing through the dark earth. Jacob stands with Ghost at his side, looking down into the ravine. It is empty now. The wreckage of the P-38 has been carefully recovered by a military team, its pieces to be part of a memorial. The forest is already reclaiming the space, the scar on the landscape slowly healing. In his hand, Jacob holds a new walking stick, carved for him by Sam from a smooth, strong piece of hickory. He no longer leans on it with the weight of his past, but uses it for balance on the path forward. The sun is rising, casting long, golden shafts of light through the trees. A new day. Ghost leans his weight against Jacob's leg, a familiar, comforting pressure. Jacob rests his hand on the dog's head, his gaze on the brightening horizon. The air is clean and cold and full of promise. The ghosts have been heard. And in the sacred silence of the morning, Jacob Thorne is finally at peace.